But I am reading out to you the summary of the previous one because it's very interesting what he's saying. I'll summarize for you and then we can have a brief discussion before we read the next paragraph. So, he is describing the manifestation of Satchidananda. Satchidananda, which is outside time and space, manifests itself in the physical world. How does it do that? Satchidananda has consciousness and force. It has got knowledge as well as power. It manifests itself, expresses itself, and realizes itself. Okay? It has got the power to make a plan, and that plan becomes, it executes the plan, and it becomes a reality. Okay? That's what he's saying. There are three things. First of all, you have to plan something. Then you have to go about doing it, and finally you have to achieve it. Even in the physical world, these three things are always there. If you look carefully, you will see that everything, you first in your mind, you say, oh, I have to do this. And then you go about making the necessary arrangements, and then you finally do it successfully. So Satchidananda has consciousness and force. It manifests itself, number one, expresses itself, number two, and realizes itself, number three, through its powers of, how does it do it? Will and delight. Okay? Will is force and delight, Ananda. It enjoys what it is doing. In a cosmic, just 1 second. Yeah. In a cosmic infinity of unending multiplicity, it expresses itself in every possible way. To do this, it employs. What are the methods it employs? This is the interesting thing I was talking about. It employs variation. It employs the possibility of making the many out of one. Inversion, okay? It makes something and inverts it also, makes it the opposite of itself. Conservation, it also maintains something and conserves it. It makes something and doesn't let it disappear. It conserves. Conversion also, conservation and conversion. It changes also things, okay? And this is the, and conversions of energy, even perversions. This is what I wanted you to understand. So it is using variation, inversion, the opposite of itself are going inwards, conservation, conversions of energy. Conversions of energy, we know there are so many different types of energies, and each one is doing something. Even perversions, there you are. So the dualities come into the picture. Okay, it is creating truth. It expresses different forms of truth, and even creates the opposite of truth, perversion. Okay? It creates generosity and also creates miserliness. It creates gentleness. It also creates cruelty. But these are words which we are using. For him it is not cruelty. For him it is not falsehood. For him it is only the opposite of that. To understand this again and again, we use the word a gentle breeze and a strong breeze. Both are only winds. Okay, there is no question of cruel and gentle. It is just two different poles of the same force. Then he is saying, this Satchidananda does all this universally as well as individually. So not only does it do it universally at a vast level, but also individually. So whatever is there in the universe, he creates an individual also along the same pattern. But allowing and ensuring the success of the activity is the static power of stability and silence. So while it is creating movement and force and multiplicity, it remains itself the same. It does not change. In other words, the silent water behind the dam is going on producing different streams down below. And the streams down below, the multiplicity cannot exist without the silent, static water behind the dam. Okay? So that's what he's saying. This immutability is not tamasic inaction. Okay? It is power held back, but ready to leap into action. It's a dynamic stability. The stability is not negative, it is positive. It's a dynamic stability. This status is impartial. One, not only originating the dynamic activity, but also governing and channeling it into whatever aim of delight of existence it intends to achieve. So first of all, it is impartial. It has no wants and desires. It has no likes and dislikes. It just goes on left and right, creating everything possible. This idea is very important. The impartiality, okay, completely. When you are a witness, that's what you experience. You are impartial. You don't take sides. Only one, not only originating the dynamic activity, but also governing, channeling into whatever aim of delight it intends to achieve. So this is also another interesting thing, like it creates something, but does not say, I have created you, you do whatever you want. Okay? Like an irresponsible parent who creates a child and says, I don't care what you do, you are on your own. No. The divine, the transcendent, creates the universe, but governs it and guides it, and also guides the individual. He comes down himself into it, and like a responsible parent, he guides it. Okay? This is the idea which Srimad repeats everywhere in different words. It is the Purusha, silence and status, that permits Prakriti to execute his own aims. He uses his power to do whatever he intends to do. Intention but impartiality. Okay? In the Jnana Yoga, we have to realize and unite ourselves with the divine Prakriti, because we are doing Jnana Yoga, we have to do that. This is according to Swayambhu's integral yoga, okay? Divine Prakriti. But we have to also realize and become Purusha. We have to become both consciousness as well as power. The other yogas are not interested in power, okay? But we are interested in power. Swayambhu's yoga. The individual has to take delight in possessing his own nature and making it into the image of the divine nature, Paraprakriti, but not letting it linger in the body mind life, which is the Apara Prakriti. The body mind life is a lower Prakriti, and that's not what you should allow. You have to transform it according to the upper Para Prakriti, the higher nature. Lower nature, where ego, limitation, and ignorance abound, has to be changed into the divine nature. Okay? This higher Purusha is a real man, not our ego. The normal man with his body, life, mind is not the whole of the real man. We have to become the divine man, Purusha, possessing Prakriti fully at all the levels. That's the interesting point. The Jnana Yogis and the Mayavadis are possessing the divine, but only at the higher level, not at the lower level. Okay? The lower level is left to itself. You go whatever you want to do, we are not interested. Body mind life is imperfect and impermanent, so we reject it, not Srivamda. We have to become the divine man, Purusha, possessing Prakriti. We have to be master of our own nature, but at all the levels, at the supramental level, at the spiritual level, and at the physical level. This is what he said in the previous one. Okay. Now we come back to this individual being of ours. Have we read it once? If we have not, one of you has to read.
No, we have not read it.
Okay, then Yasmin, you might as
yeah, can I read it?
Yeah, read it, please. This individual being of ours.
This individual being of ours is that by which ignorance is possible to self-conscious mind. But it is also that by which liberation into the spiritual being is possible and the enjoyment of divine immortality. It is not the eternal in his transcendence or in his cosmic being who arrives at this immortality. It is the individual who rises into self-knowledge. In him it is possessed, and by him it is made effective. All life, spiritual, mental, or material, is the play of the soul with the possibilities of its nature. For without this play, there can be no self expression and no relative self expression. Even then, in our realization of all as our larger self and in our oneness with God and other beings, this play can and must persist. Unless we desire to cease from all self expression and all but a trance and absorbed self-experience. But then, it is in the universal being that the trance of this liberated play is realized. The trance is in this mental being's immersion in the soul experience of unity. The liberated play is the taking up of his mind into the spiritual being for the free realization and delight of oneness. For the nature of the divine existence is to possess always its unity, but to possess it also in an infinite experience from many standpoints, on many planes, through many conscious powers or selves of itself, individualities in our limited intellectual language of the one conscious being. Each one of us is one of these individualities. To stand away from God in limited ego, limited mind, is to stand away from ourselves. To be unpossessed of our true individuality, to be the apparent and not the real individuality. It is a power of ignorance. To be taken up into the divine being and be aware of our spiritual, infinite, and universal consciousness as that in which we now live is to possess a supreme and integral self. Our true individuality is our power of self-knowledge.
Very interesting para, and we'll have a look at what he's saying. Okay. Now, so the individual being of ours. Now, what do we understand by the individual being of ours? It is a spiritual being, okay, which is really your individual being. But what do we mean by the individual being? Not the body-mind life. The body-mind life are clothes given to the individual being. The individual being, you can use the word Jivatman. And what is the Jivatman? It's the portion of the divine which has come down and limited itself into a form. Okay, it has got characteristics. The infinite divine is infinite. He has got all the characteristics and he has got everything. But the individual, the universal divine, makes himself, you can use very strange language. You can say he breaks himself up into, but breaking is a very negative word. So we can say he divides himself purposely into many individual souls. And he says, I want to enjoy what I'm doing, but I don't want to enjoy it only in one way. I want to enjoy it in 100,000 million ways. So he makes individual souls and he tells each soul, which is his own being, enjoy, but in your own way, your own swabhava. I give you a nature, and according to that nature, you enjoy what has to be done. Come back to me, but through your path. Let the others also go through their paths. This is the individual being, the Jivatman. The Jivatman is spiritual in essence, okay, but it is sleeping in the lower levels. It has to wake up and slowly realize itself. And when it wakes up and slowly realizes itself, there are many, many stages. The first stage of the individual being is the atom. Okay? The divine presence is there in the physical world. So that's the atom. But the atom, the divine presence in it, will try to get out of its limitation. So as soon as there is a possibility of migrating into a slightly higher form, it does that. So it goes into insects, it goes into microbes, it goes into viruses, because that's it superior to the atom, because the atom is inanimate. So it goes into the animate. From there it goes on into higher forms of life. Okay, it goes on slowly, slowly, slowly evolving. Now that individual being which was unconscious, apparently unconscious, is becoming conscious more and more. Finally, when it comes to the animal level, it becomes the soul. It is more expressed. When finally it comes into the human being, the soul becomes the psychic being. And when you go into the spiritual planes of consciousness, the psychic can merge into the self. You become universal. You are no more limited. You have become vast and you have identified yourself with the cosmic. But there is still something else. You have to identify yourself with the total divine. So you go back to where you came from. So the individual being goes slowly through many lives and many adventures and many vicissitudes, ups and downs through thousands of years. Finally goes back to God. Okay. So this is what is described. This individual being of ours is that by which ignorance is possible to self-conscious mind. You have purposely, the divine has purposely put himself into the opposite of himself. And he is saying, this is the adventure that I am going to go through. So it is the ignorance which becomes possible to self-conscious mind. But it is also that by which liberation into the spiritual being is possible. So although he has plunged himself into the ignorance, each of us, all of us, each one is the divine essentially, which has come down from the highest level, and we have lost our divinity. Okay? We have lost our divinity. This is the truth. And this is interesting because we always like to think in terms of images. That is exactly what has happened. Okay? In the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, exactly. Ram is banished into the forest, full of danger, darkness, okay, difficulties. This is a symbol. The divine has come down into the physical world of darkness. And through 14 years of exile, 14 years is usually descriptive of a long period. Life imprisonment in all over the world is 14 years. So 14 years you have to struggle in the forests and density of the world. This, and finally you become again, you regain your Ramarajya. You become the divine. Same with Mahabharata also. The Pandavas are sent away into the forest, okay, and discover yourself, finally possess your own kingdom. And what is your kingdom? It's interesting because body, mind, life, okay. Your body, mind, life is the kingdom of the divine, also the lower levels, that also you possess, okay. So this is what he's saying. So keep this in mind. This individual being.
Hello.
Yes,
In
yes.
the Mahabharata, the
Ah,
Pandavas are also exiled for 14 years.
yes, yes.
Oh, it's similar then.
Yeah, absolutely. It's only 13 years, and the last year is incognito. They have to live without being recognized. And if they are recognized, then they have to go through again the 14 years, they have to repeat. That is why Arjuna dressed up as a lady for dance. Okay, this is why this is the symbol. In other words, a yogi is not recognized in the world. Okay, that's the symbol again. A yogi, no one recognizes him as a yogi. Okay, so all right. So the individual being of ours is that by which ignorance is possible to self-conscious mind. But it's also that by which liberation into the spiritual being is possible and the enjoyment of divine immortality. You have the power to become divine again. Okay? It is not the eternal in his transcendence or in his cosmic being who arrives at this immortality. It's not the divine himself who is getting back his divinity. He is not. It is the individual, the divine who has made himself into the individual, and therefore there is separation also. And that individual divine is now regaining his own kingdom. It is not the eternal in his transcendence or in his cosmic being who arrives at this immortality. It's an individual divine. Okay? It is the Jivatman, if you want. It is the individual who rises into self-knowledge. In him it is possessed, and by him it is made effective. Okay? His self-knowledge is the spiritual knowledge, and he gets that back, and in him, and it is possessed by him, it becomes effective. All life, whether it is spiritual, mental, or material, is the play of the soul with the possibilities of its nature. This Shabda says always the Purusha and Prakriti are always playing hide and seek with each other. At every level, Purusha and Prakriti are playing with themselves. Okay. In Savitri, he says the exchange of eyes. Okay. They are always together, but in different proportions. Only at the highest level they become equal to one another. So, remember, also we have repeated this, but we repeat again. In the physical world, Prakriti is power. Okay? Matter is power, but there doesn't seem to be any consciousness. Purusha is sleeping while Prakriti is dominating. Okay? This is the image of uh, the divine, under whose foot there is a small child or something like that. I think it is. I think Nataraja's image, na? Under his dancing foot there is a. So this is the Prakriti, power is keeping the consciousness down below. Okay, and this is the image. But as the Purusha awakes and goes up in the self, what happens? The power is held back. So now Purusha, the consciousness, holds power in himself but does not allow it to express itself. So it is immutable. The spirit, the self becomes immutable. Atman, Brahman, the power is there, but it is held back. You are not in possession of it. So this is the experience what is saying. All life, at all the levels, spiritual, mental, or material, he has given you 3 levels. Spiritual at the highest level, mental at the middle level, and material at the lowest level, is the play of the soul with the possibilities of its nature. And that is the possibilities. Everything that is there in your nature, you experience it. Whether it be sin, or whether it be cruelty, or whether it be jealousy, all this you experience all these things. Because then only with experience only you can grow. Without experience you can't grow. Okay? Is a play of the soul with the possibility of its nature. For without this play, there can be no self-expression and no relative self-experience. Now note that, it's very interesting, because we have ideas of sin and virtue. But sin and virtue are not sin and virtue to the divine. They are only different aspects of self-expression. Okay? As I keep saying, soft breeze and strong breeze. Strong breeze can be destructive also. So we attach negative values to it. But the divine does not negative value. It's only hard and soft. That's all. They are 2 different poles of the same force. That's what he explained. Okay? There can be no self-expression and no. There is another way of putting this. Suppose I have an enemy to conquer. Okay? If I don't know the nature of the enemy and I don't know his weakness and his strengths, how am I going to conquer him? I can't. I'll be ignorant. So I have to know his weakness as well as his strength. That is the reason why you have to go through all these experiences of the duality. You have to go through ignorance, you have to go through, not every time, but cruelty, miserliness, okay, negativeness, all this you have to experience, know its nature, and then you are in a position to conquer it. Other way of expressing the same thing is, as Srimanta says, truth and falsehood are always go hand in hand. Error is the handmaiden of truth, he says. Okay. So we don't need to see it in a negative way. Even when we feel sometimes a sense of inferiority and we feel a sense of guilt. Really speaking, there should be no sense of guilt at all, even when we do something wrong. We have to look at it like cold mind and we have to see, oh, so this is the nature of that. And this is creating disturbance. I have to repair it. You have to look at it that way, not feel guilty. Remorse and guiltiness and repentance have no essential value. You have to learn from your mistakes. Okay, so interesting. So, even I go back to the text. Even then, in our realization of all as our larger self and in our oneness with God and other beings, this play can and must persist unless we desire to cease from all self-expression and all but a trance and absorbed self-experience. This, the ascetic is deciding the other thing which Srimanta does not want. He's saying, if you desire to cease from all self-expression and all but a trance and absorbed self-experience, this is what the ascetic is doing. But Srimanta is saying, not necessary to do that. Okay? He's saying, Even then, in our realization of our larger self and in our oneness with God and other beings, this play can and must persist. It can persist and must persist. That means it can, even when you are a yogi in the lower planes of consciousness, all the defects will be there. But those defects must be now changed into their positive values. That's what he's saying. Okay, miserliness must become generosity. Cruelty must become gentleness. Falsehood must become truth. Even at the lower level, that's the whole point. Unless we desire to cease from all expression and all but trance and absorb self. But then it is in the individual being that this trance or this liberated play is realized. Okay. Not in the cosmic, it is the individual who is realizing this. Either trance or liberated play. Trance is consciousness is liberated, but it's not liberated in the body-mind life. But Srimad is using a very interesting word, liberated play. In other words, you are liberated, but you are still in the body-mind life, the liberated play. So the trance is the ascetic, and the liberated play is the Srimad ideal of remaining in the physical world. The trance is this mental being's immersion in the soul experience of unity. The liberated play is the taking up of his mind into the spiritual being for free realization and delight of oneness. So, you have two choices. You can either disappear, I want only peace, I want unity, I want oneness. Fine, so there is no problem with that. But there is the other thing also, the liberated play in taking up of his mind into the spiritual being, take a consciousness of the spiritual being, become free, but start enjoying the physical world also, come down, and when you come down this time, you are pure, you don't have any limitations. For the nature of the divine existence is to possess always its unity, but to possess it also in an infinite experience from many standpoints, on all planes, through many conscious powers or selves of itself, individualities, in our limited intellectual language of the one conscious being. So, Sendra is saying, the divine is doing that. He is creating the transcendent. The transcendent is creating the cosmic and the individual. So why should the individual not participate in God's way of doing things? That's what he said. We should also come back. But coming back down, but this time without losing consciousness, without losing knowledge, without losing power. To stand away from God. Okay, no, one second. Each one of us is one of these individualities. Very interesting sentence. Each one of us is one of these individualities. If you remember, we discussed Swabhava and Swadharma. So when the divine is creating these souls, to each one he gives a nature, which is a Swabhava. That's what he's saying here in a slightly different language. Each one of us is one of these individualities. Each one has got a different Swabhava. Even the soul has got Swabhavas. Don't forget that. Okay? Don't think that when you become divine, everyone becomes the same. That's not true. It's an idea which can occur to you. But the divine is the same everywhere. No, the divine also wants multiplicity. Note, interestingly, how Mother was into music and painting, and Srimanta was into literature and poetry. Okay, both are divine, but different expressions. The swabhava of each individuality, each individual self, becomes the swadharma of each one, and the swadharma goes on changing for everybody. Okay? To stand away from God in limited ego, limited mind is to stand away from ourselves, because we are the divine. To be unpossessed of our true individuality. Srimanta is very fond of the word possession and unpossessed. That means you are not in control of it. When you don't possess one thing, you have no rights over it. But when you possess something, you are the master. You have the right over it. So you have to possess your body, mind, life. To be unpossessed of our true individuality, to be the apparent and not the real individual. The apparent individual is the body, mind, life. And the real individual is the Jivatman, the soul, which is spiritual. It is our power of ignorance. The individuality is our power of ignorance to be taken up into the divine being and be aware of our spiritual, infinite and universal consciousness as that in which we now live, is to possess our supreme and integral self, our true individuality. It is our power of the self-knowledge. When you are in ignorance, it is not a negative state, Sri Aurobindo is saying. You have to look at it positively. It's your power of ignorance. Very interesting the way Sri Aurobindo looks at it. When you are in the spiritual consciousness and the supramental consciousness, it is your aspect of real knowledge. When you are down here in ignorance, it is your aspect of limitation in ignorance. You have done that by your own choice. Why? Because of the adventure. Here you have to grow. You have come down into what you are and you have to grow. Okay? So, we have come to the end of the paragraph. Okay, so now, if you want, I can read the summary quickly and then you go on to the next paragraph. So what he is saying, man has a soul and self which is his infinite real person. These allow the dwelling in the upper hemisphere of oneness and knowledge. Our human being, we can go there. Man also has an individual being of body, mind, life. Okay, he's also got a lower level. Okay, it's like a house which has got 7 floors. You, the 7th floor also belongs to you. The ground floor also belongs to you, which is his outer nature. It is only a transient appearance. The body, mind, life is a transient appearance. This lower being allows the consciousness to dwell in the lower hemisphere of multiplicity and ignorance. The higher is allowing the lower to exist. But the lower nature is also capable of liberation by rising into the higher hemisphere. It's your own house. From the ground floor, you can go to the higher level, but you have to make an effort. That is yoga. It is not the eternal divine consciousness that is liberated, because that is always free. It is the individual soul in the ignorance that is that is liberated by rising into the higher hemispheres. On all the planes of existence, there is the interplay of Purusha and Prakriti, soul and nature. Even when God is realized, the play of Purusha and Prakriti can and must persist unless the ascetic renunciate, unless like the ascetic renunciate, unless you don't want to do that. Man chooses to ignore the lower hemisphere and prefer the absolute oneness of the higher hemisphere. This is what the ascetic is doing. Okay for him. Sri Aurobindo does not have any objection. Then there is only the absorbed trance. So if you are like the ascetic, so long as you are in the physical world, your awareness of the physical world is not there. You are in an absorbed trance. But there is also a waking trance. That is Sri Aurobindo's idea. The nature of the divine always insists on the possession of unity. You must see the oneness. But it also wants possession of unity in the many. Okay? You must see both. Unity in the many, in the infinite experience of all standpoints. Each individual is unique and has a variable, peculiar point of view. That's why we have to respect everybody's point of view. We need not always agree, but we have to respect it. Okay? To fix oneself in ego, in limitation, is to distance oneself from God. His state of ignorance means non-possession of unity. The state of ignorance, his state of ignorance, by the way, not your state. Divine state of ignorance means non-possession of unity. This is the power of ignorance. Power of ignorance. It's not negative. It is positive. Ignorance is the power of knowledge to limit itself. This is what Sri Aurobindo goes on saying everywhere. This is the power of ignorance, seeing only the many. To fix and see oneness even in the lower hemisphere of the many is the power of self-knowledge and discovery of our true integral self, our true individuality. This is what he said. Now we have about 10 minutes, so we can still read the next paragraph. Okay. By knowing the eternal unity. So Yasmin read, next whoever has to read by knowing the eternal unity. Okay? Shall we do that? So who will read? Whoever is in a position to read.
Shall I read?
Yes, please go ahead.
By knowing the eternal unity of these three powers of the eternal manifestation, God, nature, and the individual self, and their intimate necessity to each other, we come to understand existence itself and all that in the appearances of the world now puzzles our ignorance. Our self-knowledge abolishes none of these things. It abolishes only our ignorance and those circumstances proper to the ignorance, which made us bound and subject to the egoic determinations of our nature. When we get back to our true being, the ego falls away from us. Its place is taken by our supreme and integral self, the true individuality. As this supreme self, it makes itself one with all beings and sees all world and nature in its own infinity. What we mean by this is simply that our sense of separate existence disappears into a consciousness of illimitable, undivided, infinite being, in which we no longer feel bound to the name and form and the particular mental and physical determinations of our present birth and becoming, and are no longer separate from anything or anyone in the universe. This was what the ancient thinkers called the non-birth or the destruction of birth or nirvana. At the same At the same time, we continue to live and act through our individual birth and becoming, but with a different knowledge and quite another kind of experience. The world also continues, but we see it in our own being and not as something external to it and other than ourselves. To be able to live permanently in this new consciousness of our real, our integral being, is to attain liberation and enjoy immortality.
If you attain liberation, you can enjoy immortality of the soul, but you must be able to live in the physical world also. That's what Shannon is saying. So today we have got 5 minutes. So I will read the summary of what he is saying here. Okay? And then, if you have got time, we will read each one. But basically, what he is saying is the same thing. Our ignorance I am reading the summary of what he is saying. Okay? Our ignorance in the lower hemisphere is abolished completely when we realize the divine in his three, just one second, in his yeah. Yeah. When we our ignorance in the lower hemisphere is abolished completely when we realize the divine in its three fundamental poises. Remember what the three fundamental poises are? The transcendent, the cosmic, and the individual. All our problems of incomprehension in the ignorance are now resolved. In the integral yoga, none of them are rejected or abolished as they are often enough in other systems. As they are in other systems, you reject everything. But here in cerebral yoga, you transform them. What stands abolished is our ignorance. Okay? Our ignorance and all correlated factors that bound the soul to the body mind life in the lower nature. When we realize our true self, the ego is replaced by the true individuality, then the cosmic consciousness is experienced and the realization of the one in the many in the one becomes a living truth. What this means is this: we are no longer bound to body-mind life, and the sense of separation with others is negated. We don't feel ourselves to be separate from everybody else, as we do now. The ancient sages describe this experience as the nirvana or the non-birth. Okay? Birth means ignorance, and non-birth means you are not coming down to the physical world, you have realized that you are one with everybody else. Although our consciousness dwells in the divine planes, we are still firmly operating the lower nature and we are living in the divine life. We are living the divine life. In this condition of integral living, the soul attains liberation and also enjoys immortality. This is what Sri is saying. So, if you want, we'll take this up next time in detail. We have read it today. By knowing the eternal divinity. This is it. And we have, now it is only, we have got 3 minutes left for 8:35. So, we can stop here today. Okay. One of you record it. Okay. Whenever I am recording on my chat, it disappears. I don't know why, but so I can put it. Okay, so it is page 439. Okay. PP 439, and read from by knowing. Yeah. Oh, let's see. 439, correct. Rachana has put it. Okay, au revoir everybody. Have a nice day.